Alright, welcome back everyone. We are here with another chess video. This one is slightly different because we're going to go a little bit into the history of chess. But before we get to that, of course, this is all connected to the overarching question, what gender is a pawn in chess? And this is such a comical topic because anyone who's been here at least since the Netflix show The Queen's Gambit, you've probably seen at least one, two, maybe half a dozen of these different threads online. There's so many forum threads that have this topic. It's almost like a meme at this point, where it's kind of like the en passant thing, where it's just so common, so many trolls, so many new players who get confused and really don't know. So many people just led astray. Such a silly thing to bring up. People actually get really serious into this. They actually have these really deep discussions like, okay, well, let's see. A pawn is like a soldier, and then he gets to the other side, he's a queen. So is the pawn a guy? Is he boy? Is he girl? Is he man? Is he woman? It's so silliness. If you want the real answer, a pawn is an inanimate object. It's a piece of wood or plastic or glass or whatever your chess piece is made out of. And that's the answer. End of the discussion. But of course, you've probably come to this video for a little more in-depth quality answer. So let's give something a little more in-depth than the short version of that. Okay, so one of the things these discussions have brought up, as we've mentioned, is the concept of promotion. I think really this whole argument stems from the problem that when a pawn gets the other side of the board, it promotes into a queen. And it's pretty self-evident that, okay, the king piece is probably male. Granted. The queen piece is probably female. Okay, makes sense. You don't really think of the gender of the pieces too much until the pawn is on the 7th rank, advances all the way up the board, and then it's about to promote. But then some people take it way too literal, and they see, okay, well, a queen is probably female, but, what about a knight? How can you tell what a horse is, or the soldier on the horse, or a bishop? Historically, some bishops have been male or female. And then a rook is an inanimate object. That's just a castle. How do you define that? So you can see why this is a silly topic. So what I think it is, I think you have to go back to the original game instead of chess. And the original game that chess actually came from is an ancient Indian game called Chaturanga. And that dates to roughly 600 AD with the rules that we sort of more or less, know and have recorded. Some things we don't know. For example, there's a lot of debate with historians on how the stalemate rule worked. General consensus for the most part seems to be that in Chaturanga, the person who is stalemated is the one that loses the game. Kind of like if your king was trapped and you have to move, your king would move somewhere and then he would get captured, and lose the game. So little details like that they're a bit fuzzy on. But overall, we do know the rules of this ancient game Chaturanga. And it's a really interesting game. And it's played on an 8x8 board, just like the chessboard here, 8x8 grid. In Chaturanga, there are no colored squares, so there's no light squares, no dark squares. It's just 8x8 grid. But a lot of the pieces are super similar, and this is where chess basically evolved from. And same thing with checkers, and same with all the other games that are played on an 8x8 grid. So, with Chaturanga, all of these pieces that we know as pawns, they were called infantry. And so infantry are like your basic soldiers. Historically speaking, most of those were male, especially in ancient India, at that time. So it's a safe assumption to say that all of the pawns are male if you go by that, definition. Now, I actually like using Chaturanga as this, narrative for trying to assess whether a pawn is, male or female or what the gender is. Because when it reaches the other side of the board, we're thinking king and queen because we're thinking chess. But in Chaturanga, that was not actually the case. When an infantry reached the other side of the board in that game, it would promote into the piece we sort of call a queen. But that piece was called a commander. And I think it makes a lot more sense when an infantry literally promotes, and now he's a commander. So it's literally like he's getting a promotion in the military. So that narrative makes a lot more sense. And really what messes this up is when Chaturanga eventually moved to Europe, the Europeans adopted the game, they made a few changes, and one of those changes was renaming all the pieces. And I think really this is what the whole things started, where we got the confusion with promotion many years later. People making jokes about it in these online forums, because really, a soldier promoting doesn't really matter what gender they are. Now they're some rank higher, some kind of commander, whatever. And I think that's a lot more consistent with the board game. So that's an interesting, way to look at it there. Now, going from the commander, piece, sometimes, I call it commander. I think it's the most consistent. I will say that some historians do like to say instead of a commander, it's called a counselor. There's other versions that are very similar. I know chess.com variants, they have it called the Furts. There's a lot of very similar pieces with naming that's very similar like that. But overall, it's very similar to basically what we could call the queen. So, we're going to just say, for simplicity's sake, it's a pawn promoting into a queen in the ancient game. Now, something that's a little interesting here is chess.com actually has a variant, Chaturanga. So you can actually play this variant if you actually wanted to. So how you would get this here, I can just show just so everyone knows. Maybe after, the game, you could play a game of Chaturanga yourself. So all you would do is you just, wherever you're in chess.com, your profile or whatever, wherever you're at. So you would just go to your sidebar here, and it's under play, just like how you'd normally play a chess game. But it's under here, this subsection, 4-player chess and variants. And if you click that, it'll take you to the variants on chess.com. And there's a bunch of them, including Chaturanga. And so that's the one that we're going to sort of talk about here a little bit. So here's all of our pieces. Very interesting. You can see these pawns look very similar. We're just these infantry. They're basically pawns. They move very similarly. You'll notice that the king and queen is actually flipped here. Well, our king and queen, they were called a little bit different back then. That's kind of interesting that they do that. But again, there was no color-coded light squares and dark squares. And if you really think about it, whether the king is on this file or on this file, it doesn't really matter. Because as long as they're opposing each other with the enemy one, the whole game is mirrored anyway. And because there's no light squares and dark squares, it doesn't really change the strategy any. So that's kind of an interesting point. But anyway, back to the pieces, staying on topic here. The king piece looks very similar. The queen piece sort of similar. The infantry for the pawns very similar. But now we get to these little more strange ones. Because this one that looks like the knight in Chaturanga, that was called the cavalry. Okay, that looks pretty consistent. It moves exactly how a knight would move in chess, so that makes perfect sense. Here, instead of our bishop, we have what looks like to be an elephant, and indeed, that is actually what it's called. These elephantry is the division that this is. I think chess.com has a slightly different name here. Yeah, they call it an alfil. Okay, but it's basically the elephant. It's literally the branch elephantry. So, back in ancient India, that was sort of like your prehistoric version of tanks. Modern day warfare, we have tanks, to go along with their infantry. Back then, they would ride elephants, and, that's how they got from point A to point B very quickly. So obviously that was strategic. But as far as this game, they move sort of like bishops here. So it's kind of interesting that the knight piece moves like a knight, the cavalry. But the elephant one moves kind of like a bishop, which is a little strange. And then, of course, here we have the chariots. They move exactly how a rook would move now. Now, one thing I really like about Chaturanga is that the chariot piece, interestingly enough, it kind of explains its lack of turning ability. Because I've always thought that, how could a rook, a literal castle, how could that even move? But in Chaturanga, it makes a lot more sense. Because I kind of imagine a chariot would probably be kind of hard to turn. And so, going exactly, these vertical or horizontal movements, I think that's just really consistent with the ancient game. So I really like the old naming, for Chaturanga. I think that actually makes a lot of sense. Now, another interesting thing, too, is that in addition to Chaturanga, around the same time, there was also another ancient Indian game called Chaturangi. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. I don't speak ancient Indian, but that's like a 4-player version of this. This is a 2-player version, which basically evolved into chess. You could say Chaturugi, or however it's pronounced, is sort of like an ancient 4-player chess version, and that actually looks like this, which is really interesting too. These sailboats is literally what they're called. They're the ones that move like a rook. everything else looks pretty similar to what we call for our chess pieces. So it's sort of like 4-player chess, just a lot less things on the board. But okay, but back to going to this. So, this is kind of like an overview for, this Chaturanga, kind of how it looks, at least, specifically for the naming, for when the pawn reaches the other side. Because when the pawn reaches the other side, that's what started this whole debate, what gender is a pawn. And if you're going to be historical about it, I mean, they're probably all male. You could argue that, maybe one of the pieces, like the bishop equivalent, we don't know. You could argue things like that. But, I mean, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. They're inanimate objects. They get to the other side of the board, they promote. But for simplicity's sake, I really like to think of it as all the pawns are infantry. And when they get to the other side of the board, they're just promoting. They're just basically moving up in rank. So I think that's most consistent. So, hope everyone found this long explanation for this very short question helpful. This question has been in the forums a lot, and when I first saw this topic, I was like, oh, not again, this topic, there's so many of these out there. And then afterwards I thought, hey, I could actually make a video out of this. I could make a topic and once and for all put the question to rest. So there's my answer. The pawn reaching the other side of the board, it's just promoting. It's literally just turning into a commander. So I think that makes most sense. There's nothing to do with gender at all within the question. Just simply the fact that one piece changes name. That's really all it comes down to. So hope everyone found this helpful, and I will see you in the next video.